the European Parliament is facing a major challenge. Corruption scandals have emerged, involving its own members. The Qatargate scandal is the most prominent. It has exposed how foreign countries try to influence EU decisions. In Qatargate, some members of the European Parliament, or MEPs, were caught taking money. In exchange, they supported certain policies. This scandal has exposed a worrying trend. Foreign countries are interfering in the EU's democratic processes. Countries like Qatar, Morocco, and China have been implicated. They try to sway EU policies in their favor. The upcoming European Parliament elections in June 2024 are important. They emphasize the need to address this issue. The integrity of EU democracy must be protected. The EU has started to implement reforms. These aim to make its operations more transparent. They should also make the EU less susceptible to corruption. However, these reforms need to be stronger. They need to be more clearly defined. Only then will they be truly effective. The EU needs to find a balance. It must promote transparency. It must also safeguard the work of civil society organizations. The Qatargate investigation took a dramatic turn. A massive leak of documents occurred. This revealed a larger network of corruption. It was much larger than initially suspected. The leaked files are known as the Qatargate files. They exposed over 300 alleged attempts to manipulate the EU. These attempts targeted the EU's democratic processes. Key figures were at the heart of this web of influence. These included former MEP Pier Antonio Panzeri. His aide Francesco Giorgi was also involved. These were allegedly funded by Qatar, Morocco, and Mauritania. The funding amounted to €4 million. Scrutiny of the institution's ethical standards increased. Calls for an internal investigation gained momentum. A year has passed since the Qatargate scandal broke. The European Parliament is still dealing with the fallout. There have been dramatic raids in Brussels and Italy. These led to multiple arrests. €1.5 million was seized. However, the investigation has stalled. People are concerned. They are worried about the EU's ability to address corruption within its own ranks. High-profile figures remain embroiled in the scandal, including Greek MEP Kaili. Her partner Francesco Giorgi is also involved. Some suspects have confessed. They have admitted their involvement. However, no convictions have been secured yet. The investigation is slow. This is partly because suspects maintain their innocence. Some even challenge the Belgian judiciary. They question how the case is being handled. The EU Parliament responded to the scandal. At first, the response was swift. However, it has been criticized. Critics say it is insufficient. It does not address the systemic issues. These issues allowed widespread corruption to take root. The lack of consequences is worrying. It could embolden further attempts to undermine the EU. The Qatargate scandal has exposed a vulnerability. The EU's democratic institutions are vulnerable. Foreign powers are increasingly trying to influence them. These powers use various tactics. These include lobbying, disinformation campaigns, and financial contributions. They target political parties, individual politicians, and EU institutions. These influence operations pose a significant threat. They undermine the EU's democratic processes. They erode public trust in EU institutions. They can distort policymaking. This serves the interests of foreign powers, not the EU citizens. The EU faces challenges in addressing this issue. It needs to protect its open and democratic nature. At the same time, it must guard against external influence. One challenge is the difficulty of attribution. It is hard to prove definitively who is behind these influence operations. Many are covert and sophisticated. They involve a complex web of actors. These include state actors, private companies, and individuals. This makes it difficult to attribute responsibility. It also makes it hard to impose consequences. Another challenge is the lack of a common EU approach. Member states have different threat perceptions. They have different levels of awareness about foreign interference. They have different legal frameworks. This complicates efforts to develop a coherent and effective EU response. Section 5. Calls for reform, strengthening transparency and accountability in the European Parliament. The Qatargate scandal has triggered calls for reform. These calls are coming from within and outside the European Parliament. The goal is to strengthen transparency and accountability. This will make the institution more resilient to corruption and foreign interference. Key proposals include enhancing transparency in lobbying activities, making lobbying registers mandatory and publicly accessible, tightening rules on financial disclosures, establishing an independent ethics body to investigate misconduct. These reforms are crucial to restoring public trust and safeguarding EU decision-making. The European Parliament must act decisively to implement meaningful reforms. Section 6. Balancing act, protecting civil society while combating corruption. Combating corruption and foreign interference is crucial. The EU must also protect civil society. Civil society plays a vital role in a democracy. It provides a space for citizens to engage in public debate. It holds those in power accountable. It promotes transparency and good governance. However, some measures aimed at combating corruption can inadvertently harm civil society. For instance, overly broad transparency requirements can place a disproportionate burden on smaller organizations. This can hinder their ability to operate effectively. This can also discourage citizen participation in public life. The EU must strike a balance. It must combat corruption and foreign interference. It must also safeguard the operating space for civil society. This requires carefully crafting regulations and legislation. These should target illicit activities. However, they should not stifle legitimate civic engagement. Transparency measures should be proportionate and targeted. They should not impose excessive administrative burdens on civil society organizations. The EU should provide adequate support to civil society. This will help organizations comply with new regulations. It will also help them build their capacity to resist undue influence. Section 7. The need for action, from investigations to convictions. The Qatargate scandal has shaken the European Parliament. It has also shaken public trust in the EU. Thorough and impartial investigations are essential. They must uncover the full extent of the corruption network. They must hold those responsible accountable. Investigations alone are not enough. They must lead to convictions. This will demonstrate that the EU is serious about tackling corruption. It will also deter future wrongdoing. However, investigating and prosecuting corruption cases involving high-level officials is complex. It is challenging. These cases often involve sophisticated legal and financial maneuvers. They require specialized expertise and international cooperation. The EU must provide its law enforcement agencies with the necessary resources and support. The EU must strengthen its judicial cooperation mechanisms. This will facilitate the exchange of information and evidence between member states. This is crucial for effectively prosecuting cross-border corruption cases. The EU must also work with third countries. This will ensure that individuals involved in corruption cannot escape justice by fleeing to countries with weaker law enforcement. Section 8. The future of EU integrity, lessons learned and the path forward. The Qatargate scandal is a wake-up call for the EU. It has exposed vulnerabilities in the EU's defenses against corruption and foreign interference. The EU must learn from the scandal. It must take decisive action to prevent similar incidents from happening again. The EU must strengthen its institutions. It must enhance its resilience. It must safeguard its democratic values. Transparency and accountability must be at the heart of the EU's efforts. This includes enhancing transparency in lobbying activities. It also involves strengthening financial disclosure requirements for elected officials and their assistants. The EU must empower independent oversight bodies. These bodies can investigate allegations of misconduct. The EU must invest in civic education. This will raise awareness about the dangers of corruption and foreign interference. It will empower citizens to hold their elected representatives accountable. The EU must foster a culture of integrity and accountability. This culture must permeate all levels of governance. Section 9. The shadow of doubt. Public trust in the EU tested. The Qatargate scandal has cast a shadow of doubt on the EU. It has damaged the reputation of the European Parliament. It has eroded public trust in EU institutions. This is a critical moment for the EU. It needs to rebuild trust with its citizens. Trust is essential for the legitimacy and effectiveness of any democratic system. The EU must acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. It must take concrete steps to address the concerns raised by the scandal. A failure to do so would further erode public trust. It could fuel Euroscepticism. It could undermine the EU's ability to address future challenges. The EU needs to communicate clearly and transparently with its citizens. It needs to explain the steps it is taking to address corruption. It needs to explain how it is strengthening its institutions. The EU should engage with civil society organizations. They play a vital role in rebuilding trust and promoting accountability. Section 10. A global phenomenon. Qatargate in the context of foreign interference. The Qatargate scandal is not an isolated incident, it is part of a broader global trend. Foreign powers are increasingly attempting to influence democratic processes. This is happening worldwide. These powers exploit the openness and interconnectedness of democratic societies. They aim to advance their own interests. The EU is a target for foreign interference due to its economic and political weight. It is a major player on the global stage. It has significant soft power. The EU's commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law makes it a target for authoritarian regimes. These regimes seek to undermine these values. The EU needs to cooperate with its international partners. This will counter foreign interference. It needs to share information. It needs to coordinate its responses. It needs to work together to develop international norms and standards. These will combat foreign interference. Section 11. Towards a more resilient EU safeguarding democracy in an age of influence. The Qatargate scandal is a stark reminder of the challenges facing the EU. The EU needs to adapt to a changing geopolitical landscape. It needs to strengthen its resilience against external and internal threats. The future of the EU depends on its ability to safeguard its democratic values. It needs to protect its institutions from corruption and undue influence. This requires a multifaceted approach. It involves strengthening the EU's legal framework. It means enhancing its enforcement mechanisms. It requires fostering a culture of integrity and accountability. It also requires empowering citizens to play an active role in safeguarding their democracy. The EU must remain vigilant. It must adapt to evolving threats. It must learn from its mistakes. The Qatargate scandal is a painful but necessary lesson. It offers an opportunity for the EU to emerge stronger and more resilient.